The people everyone walks past are sometimes the ones carrying the heaviest stories. The cold November rain soaked through my jacket before I even reached the bus stop. 12 hours of scrubbing marble floors, polishing crystal chandeliers, and making someone else's mansion sparkle had left every muscle in my body aching. My hands smelled like bleach no matter how many times I washed them, and the soles of my shoes felt paper thin against the wet sidewalk. At 29, I had stopped dreaming about vacations or expensive dinners. My biggest victory was getting home before my 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, fell asleep waiting for me. Mrs. Henderson from the apartment next door watched her every evening while I worked late cleaning houses across Manhattan. Every extra hour meant another grocery bill paid, another week of rent covered, another chance to give Sophie the childhood I promised she would have, even if mine had ended long ago. The streets were nearly empty as midnight crept closer. Neon reflections shimmered across puddles while taxis splashed through intersections without slowing down. Most people hurried with their heads down, eager to escape the rain. That was when I noticed him. At first I thought it was another homeless man trying to sleep beneath the narrow awning of a closed bookstore. His dark coat was soaked, one arm resting across his chest while his head leaned against the brick wall. People walked around him without a second glance. One woman frowned before crossing the street. A man in a business suit looked for half a second before pulling his umbrella tighter and continuing on. I almost did the same. Almost. Then I saw his hand trembling from the cold. Something inside me refused to keep walking. I stepped closer, careful not to frighten him. He looked to be in his early 30s, tall even while slumped against the wall. Rain clung to his black hair, and faint lines of intricate tattoos disappeared beneath the open collar of his white shirt. He smelled of expensive cologne mixed with whiskey and rainwater. His face was striking, the kind people remembered, but exhaustion had replaced whatever confidence normally lived there. "Sir," I asked gently. There was no answer. I knelt beside him despite the icy sidewalk soaking through my jeans. "Can you hear me?" His gray eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first before settling on me. For one brief moment I expected anger or confusion. Instead, I saw something I had not expected at all. Relief. "You should not be out here," I said quietly. He tried to sit up, but lost his balance almost immediately. I caught his arm before he slipped back against the wall. "I am fine," he murmured, though neither of us believed it. "No," I replied with a tired smile. "You really are not." I looked around for help, but no one stopped. The rain kept falling. Cars kept passing. The city kept pretending not to notice another person who had fallen behind. I could have called a taxi, but I barely had enough cash left to buy breakfast tomorrow morning. The nearest shelter had already closed for the night. Hospitals would ask questions he was clearly in no condition to answer. I closed my eyes for a second, hearing my mother's voice from years ago. If kindness becomes inconvenient, it was never kindness to begin with. I opened my eyes again and offered him my hand. "Come on," I whispered. "My apartment is small, and the couch is older than both of us combined, but it is warm." He looked at me as though he could not understand why a stranger would make such an offer. After a long silence, he accepted my hand. Together we walked slowly through the rain toward the only home I could give him, completely unaware that by opening my front door to a soaked stranger, I was quietly changing the course of both our lives. The first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes the next morning was the smell of fresh coffee drifting through my tiny apartment. For one confused second, I forgot there was a stranger sleeping on my worn-out couch. Then everything from the night before rushed back into my mind. I quietly checked Sophie's bedroom first. She was still asleep, hugging the stuffed rabbit she had carried everywhere since she was 3 years old. Only after making sure she was comfortable did I step into the living room. The man was already awake, sitting upright on the edge of the couch, with both feet firmly on the floor. My old gray blanket rested neatly folded beside him instead of tossed carelessly across the cushions. He looked different in the morning. The exhaustion was still there, but the haze from the alcohol had disappeared. His posture was straight, his movements calm and deliberate. Even wearing one of my late father's oversized flannel shirts while his own clothes dried over the radiator, he somehow looked like someone completely out of place inside my modest apartment. Sunlight slipped through the cracked blinds, catching the intricate tattoos climbing from beneath the open collar of the borrowed shirt and disappearing beneath the fabric covering his shoulders. Good morning, I said softly. He immediately stood. Good morning. His voice was deep but gentle, carrying none of the roughness I had expected after the previous night. I made coffee, he added, glancing toward the small kitchen. I hope that was all right. I could not help smiling. Most guests do not wake up and make breakfast. He looked almost embarrassed. Most guests are not rescued from the sidewalk. I poured 2 cups and placed a plate of toast between us. For several quiet minutes, we simply ate while the old radiator clicked and hissed against the November cold outside. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt surprisingly peaceful. Then tiny footsteps echoed down the hallway. Sophie appeared, rubbing her sleepy eyes, her blonde hair tangled from sleep, still wearing pajamas covered in little yellow stars. She stopped the moment she saw the unfamiliar man. I watched carefully, ready to explain, but before I could speak, he slowly crouched to her eye level, keeping a respectful distance. Good morning, he said with a warm smile. I borrowed your mother's couch. I hope that was all right. Sophie looked at him for several long seconds before asking the question only a 6-year-old would think to ask. Are you still sad? He blinked, clearly surprised. Why do you think I was sad? She shrugged. Mommy only brings people home when they look lonely. I felt my face warm with embarrassment, but the stranger did not laugh. Instead, something softened behind his gray eyes. Your mommy is very kind, he answered quietly. Sophie nodded as though that explained everything. She says everybody needs help sometimes. She climbed onto the chair beside me and reached for a piece of toast, completely accepting his presence with the uncomplicated trust only children possess. A few minutes later, he placed his empty coffee cup into the sink, thanked me again, and reached for his now dry coat. I should leave before I overstay my welcome. I walked him to the apartment door. I never even asked your name. He paused for the briefest moment before replying. Ethan. Nothing more. No last name. No explanation. Just Ethan. I smiled politely. Take care of yourself, Ethan. He gave a small nod, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway. I watched him disappear toward the elevator, believing our paths would never cross again. Less than 30 seconds later, the quiet morning outside exploded with the unmistakable sound of multiple luxury sport utility vehicles stopping in front of our apartment building, followed by the hurried footsteps of dozens of people entering the lobby all at once. Curiosity pulled me toward the living room window before common sense could stop me. I parted the curtain just enough to see the street below, and my breath caught. 4 black sport utility vehicles had parked neatly along the curb in front of our aging apartment building. Men dressed in perfectly tailored dark suits stepped out one after another, scanning the sidewalk with calm precision instead of panic. Neighbors peeked through their windows. Mrs. Henderson cracked open her front door across the hallway, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Children waiting for the school bus pointed excitedly toward the expensive vehicles. It looked like someone important had arrived, but nothing like that had ever happened on our quiet block. I turned back toward the hallway just as the elevator doors opened. Ethan had barely taken 3 steps before every man in the lobby straightened at the exact same moment. One of them hurried forward, stopping a respectful distance away before lowering his head slightly. Boss, he said quietly, we have been looking for you all night. My heart stopped. Boss. Ethan sighed almost imperceptibly, rubbing one hand across his forehead as though he had expected this moment from the instant he woke up. Lower your voice, he answered calmly. People are trying to start their day. The man nodded immediately. Yes, sir. Another man approached carrying a neatly folded black overcoat. Ethan accepted it without ceremony and slipped it over the flannel shirt I had lent him, carefully buttoning the expensive coat while somehow making the borrowed shirt beneath it disappear from sight. His posture changed almost instantly. The gentle stranger from my apartment was still there, but now he carried himself with quiet authority that seemed impossible to ignore. Nobody spoke unless he looked directly at them. Nobody moved until he did. I remained frozen behind the curtain, unable to make sense of what I was seeing. Sophie tugged gently on my sleeve. Mommy, she whispered, why are all those people calling Ethan boss? I opened my mouth, but no answer came. I did not know. Before stepping toward the waiting vehicles, Ethan turned back toward the building. For one brief moment, his eyes lifted to my apartment window. I instinctively stepped away from the curtain, convinced he could not possibly see me through the glass. A gentle knock echoed on my apartment door less than a minute later. My pulse quickened. I opened it cautiously. Ethan stood alone in the hallway, holding my father's flannel shirt, now carefully folded. I almost forgot, he said. Thank you. I accepted the shirt without speaking. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a thick envelope. I immediately shook my head. No. He looked genuinely confused. It is only a way to repay your kindness. Kindness is not something I sell. The words came out more firmly than I intended. We stood there in silence for several seconds. Finally, a small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. It was the first real smile I had seen from him. He slowly placed the envelope back into his pocket. Then I owe you something money cannot repay. I folded my arms. Just promise me you will not sleep on another sidewalk. He gave a quiet nod. That is a promise. As he turned to leave, one of the suited men hurried toward him carrying a phone. Ethan accepted the call without breaking stride. His calm expression returned, the quiet confidence settling naturally over every movement. I watched from the doorway until the black vehicles disappeared around the corner. Only then did I look down at the neatly folded flannel shirt in my hands. Tucked inside one sleeve was a small handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you for treating me like a person before you knew who I was." For the next several days, I convinced myself that everything had returned to normal. I folded the flannel shirt, tucked the handwritten note into my kitchen drawer, and buried myself in the familiar rhythm of work, buses, grocery lists, and bedtime stories. That was how survival worked. You kept moving until yesterday no longer had enough room to follow you into tomorrow. Sophie, however, refused to forget. Every evening, she asked the same simple question. Do you think Ethan is still sad? I always smiled before answering. I hope he is feeling better. She seemed satisfied with that, but I was not. Every now and then I caught myself wondering where he had gone and why someone with so much influence had ended up alone in the rain that night. A week later, I was cleaning one of the largest penthouses I had ever seen overlooking Central Park. Marble floors stretched beneath my feet, floor-to-ceiling windows filled every room with sunlight, and expensive artwork decorated walls that probably cost more than my entire apartment building. I worked quietly while the owners attended meetings across town, grateful for the extra hours. Around noon, I carried a bucket of clean towels toward the private elevator just as the doors opened. I froze. Ethan stepped out first, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that fit him as though it had been made that morning. His black hair was neatly combed. The faint edge of his intricate tattoos disappeared beneath the collar of a crisp white shirt, and every person behind him instinctively slowed their pace to match his. Two executives followed, carrying folders, while several security professionals remained respectfully several feet away. He looked up at exactly the same moment I did. Surprise crossed his face for only an instant before it softened into genuine warmth. "Grace," he said quietly. Hearing my name in his voice felt strangely familiar. "Hello, Ethan." The executives glanced between us with visible confusion. One of them began speaking about a meeting schedule, but Ethan gently raised one hand without taking his eyes off me. The hallway immediately became silent. "I did not expect to see you here," he admitted. I smiled, lifting the folded towels slightly. "I work here every Thursday." His gaze drifted toward the cleaning supplies beside me before returning to my face. There was no pity in his expression, only quiet respect. "Then this building is fortunate." I laughed softly. Nobody has ever complimented my mopping skills before. To my surprise, he laughed too. It was brief, genuine, and completely transformed his face. The sound caught the attention of everyone standing nearby. One of the executives looked openly stunned, as though he had witnessed something almost impossible. Ethan noticed their expressions and simply ignored them. "How is Sophie?" he asked. "She keeps asking whether you are still sad." For the first time, something vulnerable flickered behind his calm gray eyes. "Please tell her I am trying not to be." Before I could answer, small footsteps echoed down the hallway. A little girl about Sophie's age came running from another apartment after her nanny, laughing as she chased a bright red balloon. The balloon slipped from her hands and floated toward the high ceiling. Without thinking, Ethan reached up, caught the string before it drifted away, and knelt to return it with an easy smile. The little girl thanked him before running back to her nanny. I watched the exchange quietly. The powerful man everyone around him seemed to fear had just stopped an important meeting, so one child would not lose her balloon. In that simple moment, I realized the stranger I had invited into my tiny apartment had never disappeared. He had simply been hidden beneath the weight of a life very few people truly understood. After that afternoon, I told myself our second meeting had been another coincidence. New York was a big city, but strange things happened every day. Still, every time I opened the kitchen drawer and saw the folded note he had left inside my father's flannel shirt, I found myself wondering how someone surrounded by so much power could still carry so much loneliness. Life refused to slow down for questions without answers. Bills continued arriving. Sophie's school announced a field trip that cost more than I had expected. Mrs. Henderson's heater broke, and I spent an entire Saturday helping her move furniture while Sophie baked cookies from a recipe we had almost memorized together. Ordinary days were busy enough to keep my thoughts grounded. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, I walked into the neighborhood grocery store after finishing another cleaning job. I carried a handwritten shopping list with exactly $28 folded inside my wallet. Milk, bread, eggs, pasta, peanut butter, and apples. If everything stayed on sale, I might even have enough left for Sophie's favorite strawberry yogurt. I was comparing prices on cereal when I heard a familiar voice from the next aisle. Grace. I turned, surprised to find Ethan standing beside a shopping cart containing nothing more than fresh vegetables, bread, coffee, and a bouquet of white daisies. He wore dark jeans, a navy sweater, and a simple jacket instead of an expensive suit. Without the line of security professionals around him, he looked almost like any other man finishing errands after work. I did not expect to see you here, I admitted. He smiled gently. Apparently we both need groceries. Before either of us could say more, Sophie came running around the corner, holding a small box of pancake mix. Mommy, look. It is on sale. She stopped the instant she recognized Ethan. Her face lit up. You are not sad anymore. I laughed quietly while Ethan knelt until they were eye level. I am doing much better, he answered honestly. Sophie studied him with all the seriousness a 6-year-old could manage before holding out the pancake mix. Then you should come have breakfast with us someday. Mommy makes the best. Pancakes. My eyes widened. Sophie. What? She asked innocently. People who are not sad should celebrate. Ethan looked up at me, waiting for my reaction instead of answering immediately. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. He respected that every decision involving my daughter belonged to me. Maybe someday, I said with a warm smile. Sophie accepted the answer and skipped toward the fruit section. Ethan stood beside me once more. She reminds me that life can be wonderfully uncomplicated. I nodded. Children usually know what matters before adults convince them otherwise. We continued shopping together for only a few minutes, talking about ordinary things like favorite breakfasts and the unpredictable November weather. It felt surprisingly natural. There were no conversations about money, influence, or the mysterious world surrounding him. Just two people pushing shopping carts through crowded aisles while other families filled baskets around us. When we reached the checkout lanes, I quietly removed the yogurt from my cart after realizing the total would be more than I had planned. I thought Ethan had not noticed. I was wrong. As I finished paying and reached the parking lot, Sophie pulled the grocery bag open with excitement. Sitting beside the apples was the same strawberry yogurt I had quietly placed back on the shelf. There was no receipt, no note, and no sign of Ethan anywhere in sight. I looked across the parking lot just in time to see his truck disappear into the afternoon rain. He had found a way to be kind without making me feel like charity, and somehow that simple act stayed with me long after the rain had stopped. The little cup of strawberry yogurt sat in our refrigerator for 3 days before Sophie finally decided it was too special to eat alone. On Saturday morning, she carefully divided it into 2 small bowls, handing me the larger one before climbing onto the kitchen chair beside me. People who share stay happy longer, she announced with complete confidence. I smiled because arguing with 6-year-old wisdom had never accomplished much. The apartment smelled of pancakes and maple syrup. Sunlight streamed through the old windows, and for a little while the world felt wonderfully ordinary. Around noon, someone knocked gently on the door. I expected Mrs. Henderson returning the casserole dish she had borrowed earlier in the week. Instead, Ethan stood in the hallway holding a small cardboard box with both hands. He was dressed simply again in faded blue jeans, brown boots, and a dark sweater, his black jacket unzipped against the cool autumn air. The tattoos near his collar peeked out just enough to remind me that there was still an entire world surrounding him that I barely understood. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said. Before I could answer, Sophie appeared beside me with flowers still dusting her cheeks. "You came for pancakes," she exclaimed as though the invitation from the grocery store had been scheduled weeks in advance. Ethan looked at me instead of stepping inside. "Only if the invitation still stands." I laughed softly. "I suppose pancakes should not go to waste." He entered with quiet gratitude, immediately removing his boots near the door without being asked. The cardboard box turned out to contain a simple wooden birdhouse that had not been painted yet. "I found this at a neighborhood craft fair," he explained. "I thought Sophie might enjoy decorating it." Sophie's eyes sparkled. Within minutes, newspapers covered our little kitchen table, while bottles of old acrylic paint appeared from the hall closet. Red, blue, yellow, green. Tiny fingerprints quickly replaced careful brushstrokes, and before long Ethan had a streak of bright blue paint across one cheek. Sophie burst into laughter so hard she nearly dropped her paintbrush. "You look funny." Ethan touched his face, realized what had happened, and laughed with her instead of wiping it away immediately. It was the first time I had seen him laugh without hesitation. Not politely, not carefully, completely. I stood quietly at the sink pretending to wash dishes while watching the two of them argue over whether birds preferred red roofs or blue ones. The apartment that usually echoed with silence between Sophie's songs suddenly felt alive in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. After the birdhouse dried, Ethan insisted on helping me carry it downstairs to the small maple tree growing beside our building. Together, the three of us fastened it carefully onto a sturdy branch using nothing more than a short ladder borrowed from the maintenance room. Sophie stepped back proudly. "Now the birds have a home too." Ethan looked up at the little wooden house, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze before quietly answering, "Everyone deserves a place where they feel safe." His words lingered in the crisp air long after Sophie skipped ahead to chase fallen leaves across the sidewalk. I remained beside him beneath the tree, our shoulders only inches apart. Without thinking, I brushed a tiny spot of dried blue paint from his cheek with my fingertips. We both froze for the briefest moment. Neither of us stepped closer. Neither of us stepped away. We simply smiled, sharing a silence that somehow said more than either of us was ready to put into words. The little birdhouse became part of our routine. Every Saturday morning, before breakfast, Sophie insisted we check whether any birds had visited. Most days we found nothing more than a few tiny feathers or scattered seeds, but that never disappointed her. "They know it is here," she always said with complete certainty. "Sometimes feeling welcome is enough." I began to wonder if she was talking about more than birds. Ethan continued visiting only when I invited him. He never arrived unexpectedly. He never tried to solve my problems with money or influence. Instead, he showed up carrying groceries when I asked him to help cook dinner, held the ladder while I replaced a burned-out light bulb, and patiently listened as Sophie explained every drawing she brought home from school. The more time I spent with him, the more difficult it became to reconcile the quiet man sitting at my tiny kitchen table with the powerful figure surrounded by respectful silence whenever he stepped into the outside world. One chilly evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch halfway through a movie, Ethan helped me carry her carefully to bed. She instinctively wrapped one arm around his neck before settling beneath her blanket without waking. He stood beside her bed for a long moment, gently tucking the stuffed rabbit closer to her shoulder. When we quietly closed the bedroom door behind us, neither of us spoke until we reached the living room again. The apartment was peaceful except for the soft hum of the old refrigerator and the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. Ethan looked at the framed family photographs on the bookshelf before finally breaking the silence. "She trusts me." His voice carried equal parts gratitude and disbelief. I nodded. "Children usually know who makes them feel safe." He lowered his eyes for a moment. "I have spent years earning respect from people who were afraid to disappoint me. Somehow that became easier than earning trust from the people I cared about." I sat across from him, wrapping both hands around a warm mug of tea. "What happened?" He remained quiet long enough that I almost apologized for asking. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "After my father died, I inherited responsibilities I was not prepared to carry. I convinced myself that sacrificing my own happiness was simply part of the job. Eventually, I stopped visiting friends. I stopped celebrating birthdays. I stopped believing ordinary life belonged to someone like me. His gray eyes lifted to meet mine. Then one rainy night, a woman with almost nothing invited a complete stranger into her home because she could not bear to leave him alone. My throat tightened. Anyone would have done the same. A faint smile crossed his face. No, Grace. They would not. His words lingered between us with quiet honesty. I looked down at my tea before answering. After my marriage ended, I promised myself I would never allow fear to decide what kind of person I became. Some days that promise is the only thing that keeps me moving. Ethan slowly reached across the small coffee table, not to hold my hand, only to rest his fingertips lightly against the edge of the mug beside mine. It was a respectful gesture, leaving me every opportunity to step away if I wished. I did not move. Instead, I smiled through eyes beginning to glisten. Outside, the rain continued falling across the city, but inside my little apartment, too. People who had spent years carrying loneliness alone quietly realized they no longer had to carry it by themselves. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of us had expected, yet neither of us wanted to disturb. Winter arrived quietly, dusting the city with the first light snowfall, while tiny white lights appeared in apartment windows across the neighborhood. Sophie declared that the birds visiting our little wooden birdhouse looked happier with snow on the branches, and somehow I believed her. One Friday afternoon, I received a call from Sophie's teacher inviting parents to the school's winter craft fair. I smiled until she gently added, "Every child is encouraged to bring one special adult." The words stayed with me long after I ended the call. That evening, while Ethan helped Sophie finish cutting paper snowflakes at our kitchen table, I mentioned the event almost casually. Before I could explain further, Sophie looked up with hopeful eyes. "Can Ethan come with us?" The apartment became unusually quiet. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward me, waiting exactly as he always had. Never assuming, never deciding for us. I realized then that trust was not built through grand gestures. It was built one respectful moment at a time. I smiled. "If he would like to come, I think Sophie would be very happy." Sophie threw her arms around Ethan before he could even respond. His surprised laugh filled the little apartment, and he gently hugged her back with the same care he showed everything precious in his life. The following afternoon, the elementary school gymnasium buzzed with laughter, handmade decorations, and the sweet smell of hot chocolate. Children proudly displayed painted ornaments while parents wandered between tables taking photographs. Ethan looked completely different outside his usual world. He wore a simple wool coat instead of an expensive tailored suit, and although I noticed two familiar security professionals waiting discreetly across the parking lot, they remained far enough away that the day belonged entirely to Sophie. She proudly introduced Ethan to her classmates. "This is my friend Ethan. He helped me build the birdhouse." The children immediately pulled him toward the craft tables, asking for help hanging paper stars from the ceiling. I stood back watching him kneel on the polished gym floor beside a group of excited second graders, patiently helping each one tie ribbons around handmade ornaments. Several parents smiled at the sight. None of them recognized the influential man hidden beneath the ordinary afternoon. They simply saw someone who genuinely enjoyed making children smile. As the school choir began singing familiar holiday songs, Sophie slipped one small hand into mine and the other into Ethan's. "Now we match," she whispered happily. Ethan looked down at our joined hands before meeting my eyes. There was gratitude there, but also something quieter. Hope. Later, as we walked home beneath softly falling snow, Sophie skipped several steps ahead chasing snowflakes with open hands. Ethan slowed beside me. "Grace," he said gently, "I know our lives are very different. I know the world around me can be complicated, but when I am with you and Sophie, I remember the man I wanted to become before life convinced me to settle for less." I stopped walking and looked up at him beneath the glow of a street lamp. "You do not have to become someone else," I answered softly. "You only have to keep being the man who made pancakes, painted birdhouses, and remembered a little girl's favorite yogurt." His smile was warmer than the scarf wrapped around his neck. Without thinking, I reached for his hand. This time he did not hesitate. Our fingers gently intertwined as snow continued drifting around us. And for the first time since that rainy night outside the bookstore, walking home no longer felt like carrying the weight of the world alone. Spring arrived almost without warning. The bare branches outside our apartment slowly filled with fresh green leaves, and one bright Saturday morning Sophie raced into the kitchen before I had even finished making coffee. "Mommy," she shouted, barely able to contain her excitement. "There are baby birds." We hurried downstairs together, Ethan meeting us outside with 2 cups of coffee, still warming his hands. The little wooden birdhouse we had painted months earlier now held a tiny family of birds carefully caring for their chicks. Sophie smiled so widely I thought her cheeks might hurt. "They stayed," she whispered. Ethan looked at the birdhouse for a long moment before quietly saying, "Because someone gave them a place where they felt safe." I knew he was no longer talking about birds. The following weeks brought changes I never imagined possible. Encouraged by Ethan but never pushed by him, I finally applied for a small community business grant that helped working parents start neighborhood service companies. I spent evenings writing proposals after Sophie went to bed, believing only that trying was better than wondering forever. When the approval letter finally arrived, I cried so hard I could barely read it aloud. Ethan celebrated exactly the way I hoped he would. He brought takeout pizza, sparkling apple cider for Sophie, and a tiny potted sunflower for our kitchen window. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that made me feel like I owed him anything. Just quiet joy shared around our little table. A few months later, Grace's Home Care officially opened with 2 employees, a second-hand company van, and more determination than experience. Mrs. Henderson became my first office manager because, according to her, retirement had become far too boring. Life remained busy, but for the first time it felt like we were building something instead of merely surviving. Ethan continued balancing his responsibilities without allowing them to steal every piece of his ordinary life. Saturday breakfasts, school concerts, grocery shopping, and afternoons at the park became appointments he protected as carefully as any business meeting. One warm evening, nearly a year after that rainy night outside the bookstore, we gathered beneath the same maple tree where our birdhouse still hung proudly above us. Sophie spread a blanket across the grass while we shared homemade sandwiches and lemonade. Children laughed nearby, neighbors walked their dogs, and the setting sun painted everything gold. It was an ordinary evening, the kind I had once believed belonged only to other people. Sophie suddenly looked up from her coloring book and smiled at Ethan with complete innocence. "Can I ask you something?" "Always," he answered. She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Would it be all right if I called you Dad sometimes?" Silence settled gently around us. Ethan's eyes widened before filling with tears he made no effort to hide. He looked at me instead of answering. I smiled through my own tears and gave the smallest nod. Sophie did not wait another second. She wrapped her arms around him with all the strength a little girl could gather. Ethan held her carefully, closing his eyes as though protecting the moment itself. When she finally stepped back, she laughed. "See? It sounds right." Later, after Sophie fell asleep on the blanket beneath the fading evening sky, Ethan and I stood quietly beside the little birdhouse that had started everything. He reached for my hand exactly as he had that snowy night months before. "Thank you," he whispered, "for opening your door when everyone else kept walking." I smiled, resting my free hand lightly against his cheek. "Thank you for proving that kindness was never a mistake." He leaned forward slowly, giving me every chance to step away. Instead, I met him halfway, and our gentle kiss carried all the promises we had already been living long before either of us spoke them aloud. Above us, the little birds settled safely into their home as the last light of day faded across the neighborhood, reminding me that sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding the right person, but choosing to become the place where someone else finally feels at home.